Welcome to our podcast, Deep Dive MTR Explores Subsea Technology. I'm your host, Rhonda Moniz, and this is your portal to the latest news on all things subsea technology. This episode is brought to you by the publishers of Marine Technology Reporter, the world's largest circulation publication serving the global scientific, defense, and offshore energy subsea market. For more information, visit marinetechnologynews.com. So, hey everyone, welcome to this episode of Deep Dive. Well, I am super pumped about having these ladies here today with me, which, by the way, was not easy to do because they're all very, very busy. And I got all three of them, which is, I think, a big coup for me. So, extra gold star on my side. So I want to just go around a little bit here, and I'm going to introduce them first, and then we're going to start chatting. You're all used to hearing acronyms, so I'm not going to explain what those are now because we're going to get into that in a second. So let me just go along and start with who we have here on this episode of Deep Dive. So we have Kristen Yarancik she's the executive director of IOOS Association. And IOOS Association, think of it as the umbrella or parent company, if you will, or parent organization. And then we have Shayna Wisdom and Deborah Hernandez. Deborah Hernandez is with Socorro, and Shayna is with IOOS. Now there's the IOOS Association has 11 regional associations. So Shayna is the executive director for IOOS, and that's one of the RAs. So Regional Association, also known as RA. And then Deborah Hernandez is the executive director for Socorro. So we're going to talk about what all those acronyms mean and who they are. But I want to start out with Kristen, who's the executive director of the overarching organization, IOOS Association, and talk a little bit about what IOOS is and what they do, and get some more information. So, Kristen, welcome to Deep Dive. Thanks for being here. Really appreciate it. So, could you explain what IOOS Association is? Maybe explain that acronym, and then we can go from there.
Yeah, thanks, Rhonda. I'm happy to be here talking with you all. So IOOS is the Integrated Ocean Observing System. It is an organization that is kind of scaled regional to national to even global, because Integrated Ocean Observing System, or IOOS, is the U.S. contribution to the global ocean observing system. And it is comprised of these 11 regional associations. And they're out there collecting data, integrating data, and working with the user community to help develop tailored tools and data products to help make decisions about the coastal ocean environment and the Great Lakes, of course. IOOS is a federal program. It's led by NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. I'm sure your listeners have heard that acronym quite a bit. So they run the program office for IOOS. IOOS is also a collaboration between 17 federal agencies. So IOOS data support the missions of these 17 agencies. And then all of the 11 regional associations, which Deborah and Shanna can talk more about theirs, they're non-federal partners. And so the whole system is a big collaboration between different types of organizations to meet the needs of different types of users across the country.
And when you say, I want to just, before we talk a little bit more about the RAs, can you give us a little more of an example of who the users are? Because I know there's a lot of individuals and organizations and universities and things that are that use IOOS and use the information that IOOS is a part of collecting, and the RAs are a part of collecting. Could you talk a little bit more about those users and who they are?
Yeah, sure. So IOOS is collecting information about the coastal environment, so the usual kind of physical and biogeochemical information in the coastal ocean, as well as biological information. And so that supports a number of different types of use cases that range from, you know, fisheries management to search and rescue missions to citing and monitoring sustainable and industrial activity, commercial activity in the ocean, supporting tourism, recreation, human health, public health, ocean health, all of those things. So it really does support a wide range of users and the different scales of those users. So at the regional level, you're working with local communities, you're working with state and regional government offices, and you're working, of course, across the whole thing at the federal level. And the IOOS Association is the umbrella for these. We're a nonprofit umbrella for the regional associations, and we help to facilitate that collaboration across the regions and, of course, advocate and communicate about the program.
And IOOS Association is the main office or headquarters is in DC, correct?
Yep, just outside DC in Silver
Just
Spring, Maryland.
yep. Yeah, okay. And we have a map that shows all the regional associations. So, Shayna, let me start with you. I'm going to come back to Kristen in a minute, but let me talk to you about you're at AUS and you're way up in Alaska. So I'm on the East Coast with Deborah and Kristen, but you're out in Alaska. Could you talk a little bit about AUS and the region, that regional association of IUS, and what you see in sort of what kind of ocean observation technology are you guys using? What's in your neck of the woods? Because these regional associations are all very geographically specific, and their needs are very specific based on that geography. So let's talk a little bit about Alaska and what you guys have up there.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for having me. I I want to add on a little bit with Kristen what she said. I just moved to AU's 3 years ago, so I'm still kind of relatively new, getting my feet under me. And what really attracted me was the ability to work within like she said, a national integrated program, but allow for regional specificity. Because what Deborah's dealing with in the Southeast versus what we're dealing with in Alaska is completely different, but there are common themes, but it allows us to kind of use different equipment based on our users and our geography. With Alaska, we have the largest coastline of the US, and I think we're like the third least populated state. We don't have many roads, and so infrastructure is a huge issue up here of being able to install ocean assets. Like water level sensors typically need like a dock. And north of Dutch Harbor, we only have one in Nome. We deal with extreme remote and challenging conditions. In Fairbanks this week, it was negative 50
Oh my
degrees. Here
God.
in Anchorage, it was negative 17. Up on the slope, it's negative 50, negative 60, and you're dealing with extreme conditions for power and ocean. We have sea ice. We have so many different things that we're trying to do. So we do a lot of innovative testing. If we can make it work here, then it can work anywhere else, but we're really spread out. We have concentrated areas, but we're all very ocean oriented. So, commercial fishing, subsistence marine mammal harvesting, everyone's really tied to the ocean here. So, our ocean users are very knowledgeable and have very specific requests for how we can help.
I was going to say, I can imagine up in Alaska, first of all, minus 50. I'm sorry, but that would never. I'm in New England and I think it's cold, and the winter's way too long for me. I cannot imagine that, and I don't even know how. A lot of times, there's got to be systems up there that are constantly breaking down because
Yeah.
those are such extreme conditions to get the technology to work. And I've worked with a lot of the technology out. I've been out to sea and spent a lot of time working with it, and so I can't imagine trying to get it the challenges you face up there with those kinds of conditions. And I would assume also that there's a strong bond with the indigenous community. And can you talk a little bit about that too?
Yeah, that's actually one of the things I had the opportunity to do in my previous job was I worked really closely with communities along the Arctic Alaskan coast. And so we've kind of continued to build that here, but we have community sampling. I sent some pictures of people sampling for ocean acidification and HABs. You know, we send out kits and then they collected them in beer bottles because that's what they had for sample jars. We work really closely like for this backyard buoy program was when we started 2 years ago with NANUS and PAC IOOS, where we're using small wave buoys. They're about this size, like a basketball size. And I use basketball because one, I played basketball in college, so that's part of my identity. But interestingly, in the Arctic and in Alaska, basketball is kind of the sport. And so if you go into communities and talk about sizes of things, if you use basketball, everyone knows. So it's a basketball sized wave buoy that hunters, whaling captains deployed this year to use as part of their toolbox for making safe decisions. In Alaska, we are seeing extreme changes because of climate change. When I started working up here 15 years ago, the sea ice wouldn't leave until late July. Like Point Barrow opened up in late July because that's when we were trying to get through with our research vessels. And now it's opening up in mid June. And the sea ice is coming in. The storm surge is huge. There's changes that we're seeing every year that's completely different. And so having another tool in their toolbox instead of just indigenous knowledge, they can use technology to help support their decision for safe operations at sea.
And that's a great example of using advanced technologies, working with the indigenous community to solve some of the challenges and problems or find solutions to those challenges and problems that you guys have up there that are specific to that geographic area.
Mhm.
It's pretty amazing. I wouldn't have thought basketball. That's interesting. I would have thought hockey, I guess. I don't know why.
You know, with basketball, and I grew up in a small town near reservations. All you need is a hoop of whatever kind. You can use it with a basket and a ball. You don't need any other gear.
That's
Where hockey, you need a lot of gear. You know, there's all this.
Yep,
It's really easy to just play, and so yeah, basketball is the sport up here.
that's interesting. Huh. So, Deborah, maybe you could talk a little bit about Socorro and what's specific to your area, your geographic location, and what are some of the communities that you're working with, and what are some of the technologies you guys are using that may be different to what Shane is using up in Alaska,
Well, thank goodness we don't have to deal with minus 50 degrees. Other girl would
right?
have a problem with that. Yeah, so Socorro is the Southeast Coastal Ocean Observing Regional Association. I sit in Charleston, South Carolina. We operate in the coast and offshore ocean waters of the Carolinas, Georgia, and Florida, both the east and west coast. So, share the west coast with our partners in the Gulf of Mexico. And there are similarities in the technologies we're using. For example, the small, we call them spotter buoys, basketball size buoys, are being deployed. What's beautiful about them is the cost, right? They're a good bit cheaper than other like the CDIP wave buoys, which certainly are more robust and give you much greater wave spectrum data. But for communities, for gaps in the system, we're finding these small buoys help address needs for additional data. The shorelines varied. We have 2 3 foot tides on the Gulf Coast and 9 foot tides in Georgia and the Savannah area. The whole region is plagued by coastal hazards like hurricanes and particularly long term impacts from sea level rise. Some of the newer work we're doing is with communities, both just coastal communities from beaches to towns and cities, but also some minority communities. Some of our partners are working with the Gullah Geechee community, which are people that descended from former African slaves. And many of these communities are trying to understand their changing environment. Advances in technology have lowered the cost of water level sensors, of cameras. Those are a couple $1,000 pieces of equipment that can get deployed in a place that community members are familiar with, and then they can understand how the changes that they're seeing in their backyard can relate, for example, to state or regional trends for sea level rise. Okay, the water's getting this high in my backyard. We hear that, in the next 10, 30 years, it's going to be this much higher. They can understand how it's going to impact their infrastructure, their ability to get places they need to go. So those are a few of the things we're working on that are fairly new. I would say one of the biggest changes since I started this job about 15 years ago is I think our foundation will always be around the physical oceanographic measurements because they're just needed by so many of our users, whether it's maritime transportation or weather forecast offices, charter captains, you name it. Everybody wants to know waves, wind, temperature. But we're investing a good bit in marine life observations as well. Acoustic sensors that are getting deployed. We actually, one of our partners, and we didn't fund this directly, Socorro didn't, we're helping with the data management. So we're a collaborator. They heard the first right whale from a confirmed sounding from a glider south of Virginia just last week, I think. So
Wow.
exciting developments with sensor um, advances. And I would also say the demand just seems to continue to grow. Uh, we don't have trouble with sea ice. We do have boats running over our equipment all the time, though. So, not
And picking
exactly.
it up and taking it off with it.
Yes, that too.
Yeah,
That too.
that's a bit of a problem. But and also the hurricanes because, that's really important, and I can imagine why a lot of the shipping and, the mariners want that and need that information because, there's some dangerous hurricanes and we all know that that's part of some of the problems that are getting worse as the climate crisis continues and gets, advances more as far as getting worse. So, I mean, that makes sense that they would need all that information and they would need it in near real time, if not real time. So, so it's really the thing that's interesting. And Kristen, I want to ask you this question. The thing that's interesting is, so there's 11 of these RAs. So we just talked, Shayna just gave us some background on AUS, which is, in Alaska, and Deborah just gave us some information down on the southeastern side of the United States, at Sakura. It must be a challenge to have 11 regional associations with varying needs and challenges to work with. And then always keeping a pulse on the government, the administration that happens to be, at any given time. And, obviously some administrations will care more about certain things than others. And, what are some of the greater challenges at the IUS level that you see and that, some of the things that the IOOS Association handles and deals with.
Yeah. So that regional challenge and that regional differences that you mentioned is really why IUS is structured the way it was and why it was conceived that way to begin with. Knowing that each region of the US does have its own sort of different environmental challenges, um, different types of users and that sort of thing. And we wanted to design a system. Well, not me, I wasn't there at the time, but the folks that conceived this wanted to design a system that was able to very uniquely meet those needs of the local communities and local users while also serving these greater national needs. So, as you know, Deborah mentioned, IOOS data feeds into weather service models and forecasts, and that happens in a number of different types of of systems at the national level. But one of the nice things about IOOS is that it is so flexible. The infrastructure really allows us to have these very high tech things like the CDIP wave buoys, but it also allows for these more lower cost, lower technology things. And so I think it's enabled the system to evolve. It enables us to bring in new partners, address new user needs. We've been talking about how climate and the coastal environment are changing rapidly, and the needs of users is changing because they're seeing their environment change, and maybe some of these forecasts aren't keeping up because of gaps in data. And IOOS is there with the flexibility to do more, deploy more assets, all within this infrastructure. That's not just physical infrastructure, but data management infrastructure as well. And human infrastructure, human capital.
As the blue economy grows globally, Marine Technology Reporter has the world's largest audited subsea audience. MTR offers insights and analysis from researchers, innovators, and thought leaders in ocean subsea commerce, defense, and academia. At MTR, we always stay one step ahead. For more information on how you can stay on the cutting edge, go to www.marinetechnologynews.com. So I know that each individual regional association has its own challenges and its own system that it focuses on based on the geographic region that it's in. But for the most part, could you talk a little bit about the technology that's used in most of the system? Or I know, so there's buoys, obviously, and gliders, and what is some of the other technology that's used as part of the ocean observation system in the
Those really,
RAs?
yeah, the gliders and buoys really are two of the core platforms used. And then the third, I would say, is the high frequency radar, which operates in most or all of the regions. So each region might have a different mix of technology. They might emphasize use of one. I know Naracus focuses a lot on buoys, whereas Maracus, the mid-Atlantic right below them on the East Coast, has more gliders. And so it varies that way, but the data can all be it's all interoperable and integrated once it gets into the data management infrastructure of IOOS.
And how do let's say that there's people in the audience that would like to access the data and they're not sure how to do that. How would they do that?
Well, I'm going to turn that one over to one of my colleagues here.
That's good. Shayna
Anyway,
or Deborah, you want to take that one?
we're trying to make the answer be any way they want. It's available from multiple locations. One element of being a federally mandated program that came with some requirements. And one of those is that our data management system be really robust and meet federal standards, have all the appropriate metadata, et cetera. So all the regional associations have a local portal. Many of us have some specialized tools targeting to user groups like people going to the beach or boaters. But the data also gets fed up to NOAA and global data aggregation sites that enable national hurricane forecasting and other weather forecasters to make use of the data. And I think that's again one of the strengths of the data. I'll use temperature as an example. We understand that fisheries managers' temperature of the water is super important, particularly think about coral impacts, marine heat waves, but it also impacts the volume of the water and can have a big impact on maritime safety because a lot of these uh, harbor navigation channels, the tolerances are really low for these big ships. So we collect one parameter, it could be vital for a pretty broad range of users. So I'm not sure if I answered your question,
No, you
but
did actually, and I should have thought of that. I kind of threw a curveball at Kristen because that is a very RA based. I was just thinking after you started talking about, it, I was like, that's right, because even Syracuse has their own dashboard specific to the data that they're collecting. So it really is an RA based on which RA you're talking to as to how to access the data. Um, so, Shayna, what about Alaska? How would you answer that question?
Yeah, ours is, you can just go to AUS.org and then there's a link to our portal. And then the portal pulls up, and Socorro and AUS actually use the same data management contractor. So ours looks fairly similar. The infrastructure behind it is pretty similar, as well as SCOOS, the Southern California, and then SYNCUS, the Central Northern California. So the four of us have kind of a similar look to it. Obviously, different data pieces, like the Southern California has a lot of those high frequency radars for surface current mapping. We have 5 because it's just so hard to get anywhere out. And then also accessing the data, you can go to the IOOS page, and then it can link to each of the regional associations, as well as the national scale maps. There's ERDAP, and there's a few that we all put data into and then is fed back into our portals. So there is a lot of similarities between them, but each one of them has kind of their own data management contractor, and then the infrastructure looks a little bit different.
Now, I'm curious, and any of you can answer this question. I would assume maybe Kristen or Deborah, or maybe Deborah even more so, because this is already happening on the East Coast, so you may be able to answer this a little bit. I don't want to say more accurately because that's not it, but it's more. I guess in the time now, it's what's happening here is offshore wind, right? So we
right.
have the first offshore wind farms going up, and there's a lot that's going on. Obviously, that's going to be changing, and anywhere there's an offshore wind farm, that's going to have some sort of a impact on what in that particular regional association or the ocean observation in that area. um, what do you think about that? And how, I guess my question is, how do you see that changing what your regional association might do? Or
That
is it adding? I'm assuming it's adding more for you, right? It's adding more data collection, more, specific to mammal monitoring, sea turtle monitoring, a lot of monitoring.
Yes, that's a great question, and it certainly has elevated the awareness, the need for data and information, and in some ways, it highlights the value of what many of us have been doing for a long time. Um, my colleagues in the Mid Atlantic at Syracuse and up in the Northeast, where you are, Rhonda, Syracuse, have certainly been on the front lines for our community in terms of offshore wind. We are seeing some coming to North Carolina. And I think there are many efforts, many federal, state, um, agencies, a lot of stakeholders, particularly fisheries communities, who are quite anxious to understand uh, what the potential impacts are. And having good data and information, both before and after, is going to be critical to um, answering the questions. So, what Socorro is doing, and Kristen's helped organize the regional association so that we can learn from each other, is to figure out if there's a way to make it easier to both uh, get people access to data that is coming from offshore wind developers that's ocean related, And also, we're trying to figure out if it's easier for offshore wind developers or researchers who are doing work out there to get data all in one place so that any stakeholder with questions about what's happening can go to a few discrete places and find as much information as they need. So in terms of doing things differently, I don't think that's what'll happen. I think it's creating more demand for some of the expertise and the knowledge and the data that we have, to get data to the right people to answer all the questions that are being asked.
And then it's I'm gonna ask you too, Kristen, if you wanna jump in. I was just gonna say, and then it's data management. And
Yeah,
more data management, and more data management.
yeah, exactly. You mentioned passive acoustics and marine mammals, and certainly, some of the regions, near Coast and New England for sure, looking at deploying more passive acoustic monitoring and making that aspect of what they do a bit more robust to meet those needs. But another thing about IOOS is that they don't have to be the ones deploying the assets and collecting the data. They are also places where data can come from a variety of partners and then be integrated and become interoperable, to support, just greater access and availability of data, to improve decision making, reduce risk around decision making, that sort of thing, improve our models and forecasts. And as Deborah mentioned, offshore wind basically represents another user group. And so, we'll go out and we'll learn about their needs, and we will find out the best way to work with them on data collaboration and data access and tools. So, the IOOS Association is facilitating that right now. And as offshore wind starts to move into other parts of the country because of the administration's priority around offshore power from offshore wind, we're trying to better position regions where it's at a much earlier stage of development in offshore wind energy, to be part of those discussions and part of those kind of structures that'll get put in place.
And I would imagine, I mean, I was joking, but I was serious. I would imagine that probably some of the biggest challenge here with ocean observation, and then adding that layer of, offshore wind, which, as you mentioned, is another, it's another user, really. It's another stakeholder. It's another, obviously, another end user, I guess, is what it is. But because they're going to need that data going forward when they start to move around the country. They're going to start looking at what's happening here. And, and as they're moving around the country, they're already just, getting permitted areas to, and they're looking at the future of building other offshore wind farms around the United States. And um, in my mind, it's like, my God, the amount of data that's going to be collected, and the data management and governance that is all involved in that is just mind-boggling to me. It's just insane how much is going to have to not only be obviously so much is being collected, and then how to go through it. And it's a huge thing.
It is a huge thing. The volume of data is certainly just gets bigger all the time. But I think IUS's role in all of that is to maximize the value of all of that data being collected by making it all accessible together, kind of trying to create a one-stop shop as much as we
Right.
can for all this data.
Right, which makes perfect sense, actually. um
But then there's the other side, I feel right now that we're seeing is all of these data, all of these big projects, but then now everyone has a computer in their hand and need to be able to want to be able to see it. So that kind of low bandwidth, easy to see with all of that is the other side that we're trying to figure out how to make that delivery to others, because we have our bandwidth. A lot of the places in the villages have either Starlink's really helped with internet, but everyone has really slow internet, and so our portal is really hard for some of them to use because it needs a lot of bandwidth to do the visualizations and even just open. And so it's not useful to them. So as we talk about equitable service delivery, that's the other side of data, is how to make it simple and useful in the way that they need through apps or dashboards or whatever. So I think we're dealing with both this huge side and then this kind of smaller side at the same time.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point, actually. Deborah, you going to say something?
Well, I was going to actually, Shayna said it really well with a great example. I do think that the turning that huge volume of data into information that people can use. And in some cases, it's about the size of the data set so that it's something that can reach folks with limitations in terms of bandwidth. And in some cases, it's doing some on the fly analytics so they get an alert when waves are a certain height. And they don't have to be on their computer looking at a giant database to figure out whether it's safe for them to go out on a particular day. So, lots of opportunity for product development, for integration of different data sets, and for simplifying that volume in ways that enable it to get to users so that it's useful.
All of these RAs need to be um, maintained, right, by IOOS. IOOS oversees all of these 11 RAs. How do you manage that?
Yeah, so all of the IOOS regional associations actually have their own funding line in the federal budget. So, right now we're in the middle of negotiations in Congress around fiscal year 24. Our current year budget is not finalized. And so we are always at this is the funding that provides the core operational support to the regions. And it is, you know, always dependent on these appropriations. And so, we have been fortunate over the past several years to have some increases, and some of that has been directed towards specific work, like building up our capacity to observe harmful algal blooms, which is a growing concern in most parts, if not all, of the country. But that's also, the funding that we rely on to not only maintain these systems, but to try to grow them to meet some of these emerging needs. So it is a challenge. We're heading into what's probably going to be a tough fiscal environment with overall cuts to the federal budget. And we don't know the annual federal budget, and we don't know what that's going to look like yet for IOOS. But it may, require us to make decisions around, what can we do or not do in a given year, especially in terms of growth, I would think. And my colleagues can comment more on that, but how that would impact it at different regional levels. Because all of them would make different decisions based on different things. And there is, the NOAA funding line is not the only support that the regions get. They do get lots of other funding from different agencies and other sources. Often that tends to be project based, so it's not really the long term operational support and sustained operational support, but might help to develop some capacity or address some specific shorter term need. But so it's a challenge to grow the system, and that's not unique to IOOS. I think this is something that the global ocean observing system and colleagues all around the world are facing in terms of trying to sustain and enhance um, these programs.
Yeah, I think that's really well said, Kristen. And I would just add on, I'm hopeful that most folks now understand the value of long term observations, right? If we hadn't been monitoring how high the water was for, a century now, we wouldn't be able to talk about what's happening now in terms of sea level rise. And same with some other long term sensors. We have in my region a 20-year record now at some of our stations, which isn't at climate scale, but it gives folks confidence that they can relate what's happening regionally with some of the global predictions about changes in sea level. So I think at the foundation, the value for long-term observations can't be understated, because we really can't predict what we need to do to protect the places that we love, and the ways that we use them, unless we understand that change. Um, the other thing I'll raise is inflation, the cost of gas, the cost of this equipment. I mean, we've talked about gliders. They're $250,000, and they can be lost at sea. Hurricanes can, or ships can knock out a buoy. That's another couple $100,000 piece of equipment. All this stuff is on the coast in really harsh marine environments. So ship time, the gas to just get out and recover gliders or do buoy turnaround cruises, all that sort of costs just continue to rise. And we all see it with our grocery bill, right? So I think it's important for people to realize that those costs also apply to the kind of work we're doing. And so flat budgets really mean we have to cut something, because costs just keep escalating. And, Kristen, IOOS Association, does a great job carrying that message forward for us. And the last thing I'll say on this is, because the data we collect and the work we do is used by so many different stakeholders, we've had really great bipartisan support for our work. So the challenge is, um, primarily around the fact that we know that federal budgets are really tight, and hard decisions have to be made, and a lot of our people who do similar work are in the same boat. We like to make the case that we're super important, and they're really important too, but uh, uh, everything just costs more. So figuring out how to manage that better. Some good things are happening. Some sensor costs are going down, which is fabulous. It lets us serve more people. But on the whole, our costs keep going up.
Well, yeah, I'd say, and that's a little bit of our challenge with, we're being charged with equitable service delivery, of really trying to get out information to users that are historically underserved and overburdened. I mean, and we're dealing with that through this Inflation Reduction Act funding and infrastructure funding, but those are one-time shots. How do you sustain it when the cost just to get out to these villages or remote places is exorbitant? It's several $1,000s sometimes to get out to a community for us. And so that's where we're trying to find that balance of doing more, but how do you do more with less? And like she said, flat funding is a loss. So trying to be strategic is pretty tough.
Yeah, and the need for the information is certainly not going down; it's only going up. So
So, Kristen, before we wrap up, I had another question I wanted to ask you. So, we're in an election year. How would you say administrative priorities change? And if they do, how does that affect IUS, the IUS Association, and obviously the RAs as well?
yeah, thanks. That's a good question. Um, Deborah mentioned earlier in the conversation that IUS tends to be very bipartisan in Congress, and so we're about data and information. We're not recommending any specific management or conservation actions. We're about delivering the science needed to make those decisions, and the information goes towards decisions that affect the economy, national security, climate, of course, and conservation. But it crosses the boundaries of different political administrations. And so, an administration, in my experience, too, oceans tend to be pretty bipartisan, and there's been a lot of investment in ocean research in Republican administrations as well as Democratic administrations, but the emphasis on why to collect information might change. Whether they want to use it more for conservation, and biodiversity preservation and that sort of thing versus maybe exploration and understanding the economic value of the ocean. But IOOS supports all of those missions, and so we remain pretty apolitical in that aspect.
We actually say policy neutral when we're communicating with people because that really helps. It, especially Alaska is a very oil and gas state, but then commercial fishing, subsistence harvest, all of it. So saying that helps bring people together and more interested in working with us sometimes.
All right, that's a great point.
I would agree. The data can be used for multiple purposes, and while maybe the emphasis to reach particular user groups can shift with changing administrative priorities, the foundational data and information does not, and that's a large part of our success, I believe.
So this has really been informative. I really wanted to talk to you all about the IOOS Association and all of the regional associations or RAs of IOOS because it's such important work that's going on. So it's vital. And so I was really happy that I could get you guys to sit with me today and be on Deep Dive because I think the work that you're doing is really important. So thank you again for taking the time today.
Thank you, Rhonda. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
This episode of Deep Dive was brought to you by the publishers of Marine Technology Reporter. Interested in being a guest or a sponsor for Deep Dive? For more information about this podcast and many other opportunities for your company to stay informed and in the know, go to marinetechnologynews.com. And as usual, hit like and subscribe anywhere you get your podcast. See you again on the next Deep Dive.